wind cut through the valley like a blade, and Clara Whitfield gripped her shawl tighter as she ran across the frozen field, her boots crunching against the hardened earth. Something was wrong. She had heard it in the distance, a low groan carried on the cold air, the kind of sound a person makes when their body has given up before their mind has agreed to stop fighting. She had been carrying a bundle of firewood back to her small cottage when the sound reached her ears. For a moment she froze, torn between the instinct to run toward safety and the instinct to run toward the sound. But Clara had never been the sort of person who could walk away from someone in pain, even when caution told her she should. She dropped the firewood at the edge of the path and pushed forward through the tall, frost-covered grass. The sun was already sinking behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep violet, and shadows stretched long across the ground. She could see something now, a shape slumped against the base of an old oak tree near the crossroads that led into the village of Millbrook. As she came closer, her heart began to pound. It was a man. He was lying on his side, his clothes torn and covered in dust, his face pale and streaked with dirt. His breathing was shallow, and one of his hands was pressed weakly against his ribs, as though he had fallen from a great height, or been struck by something heavy. Clara had seen hunger before. She had seen exhaustion. But this was something else, something closer to collapse. "Sir," she said, kneeling beside him without hesitation. "Sir, can you hear me?" The man's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then slowly settling on her face. His lips were cracked and dry, and when he tried to speak, only a rasping whisper came out. Clara leaned closer to catch his words. "Water," he managed, "please." She did not have water with her, but she knew the stream was not far, just past the bend near the old stone bridge. Without wasting another moment, she pulled off her shawl and folded it beneath his head as a makeshift pillow, then rose to her feet. "Stay still," she told him, though she doubted he had the strength to do anything else. "I will be back before you can count to 50. She ran faster than she had ever run in her life, her lungs burning with the cold air, her mind racing with worry. When she reached the stream, she cupped her hands and filled them again and again, splashing water into the small clay jug she kept tied to her belt for moments exactly like this. Moments when the world demanded speed, and she had learned, through years of hardship, to always be prepared. By the time she returned, the man had not moved, but his eyes were open, watching the darkening sky above him with the dazed expression of someone who was not entirely certain whether he was alive or already slipping towards something else. Clara knelt beside him again and tilted the jug carefully to his lips. "Slowly," she said gently. "Small sips. Your body has had a shock, and if you drink too fast, you will only make yourself sick." He obeyed, drinking in careful, measured swallows, and after a moment, some color began to return to his face. He studied her for a long moment, as though trying to understand why a stranger would kneel in the cold dirt beside him instead of walking past. "Why?" he asked quietly, his voice still hoarse. "Are you helping me?" Clara blinked, surprised by the question. "Because you were suffering," she said simply. "Is there another reason a person should need?" He said nothing to that, only watched her with an expression she could not quite place, somewhere between disbelief and quiet wonder. His eyes were a deep shade of gray, and despite the dirt smudged across his cheeks and the exhaustion carved into every line of his face, there was something steady in the way he looked at her, something that made her feel, for reasons she could not explain, as though she were being studied, rather than simply seen. "What is your name?" she asked, trying to distract herself from the strange intensity of his gaze. He hesitated, just for a heartbeat, before answering. "Wren," he said. "My name is Wren."
"Wren,"
she repeated.
"I am Clara. Clara Whitfield. Can you stand, Wren? My cottage is not far from here, and you cannot stay out in this cold."
"The night will only grow colder, and you are in no condition to survive it alone." He tried to push himself upright, but his arms trembled and gave out beneath him almost immediately. Clara moved quickly, sliding her shoulder beneath his arm and bracing herself against his weight. He was taller than she had expected, and though his body was thin from what she assumed was days of travel without proper food, there was a solid strength beneath his frame, the kind that suggested he was not accustomed to weakness, that this collapse was an exception rather than his natural state. "Lean on me," she said. "We will go slowly." Step by step, they made their way across the frozen field. Clara guiding him with a patience that surprised even herself. She had never been a particularly strong woman, not in the way that mattered for physical labor, but something in her refused to let him fall, refused to let the cold claim someone she had already decided, in her heart, that she would not abandon. The walk to her cottage, which normally took only a few minutes, stretched into what felt like an hour. By the time they reached her door, both of them were breathing hard, and the last light of day had faded into the deep blue of early evening. Clara pushed open the door with her free hand and guided Ren inside, settling him onto the small wooden chair beside her hearth. The cottage was modest, nothing more than a single room with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves lined with jars of preserved vegetables and dried herbs. It was not much, but it was warm, and warmth was exactly what Ren needed. Clara knelt before the hearth and worked quickly to build a fire, striking flint against stone, until the kindling caught and the flames began to grow. She fed the fire carefully, watching it climb higher, watching the warmth begin to spread through the small space. When she turned back to Ren, she saw that his eyes had closed again, though his chest still rose and fell steadily, and she allowed herself a small breath of relief. She fetched a wool blanket from her bed and draped it over his shoulders, then filled a small pot with water from her jug and set it near the fire to warm. She had little food in her cottage, only what she had managed to grow and preserve through the harvest season, but she knew that whatever she had, she would share it with him. There was no question in her mind about that, no hesitation, no calculation of cost against benefit. It was simply the way she had been raised to think, the way her mother had raised her before illness had taken her away, and her father, before an accident on the northern road had taken him as well. She sat across from Ren, watching the firelight flicker across his face, and wondered who he was and what had brought him so far from wherever he had come. His clothes, though torn and dusty, were not the rags of a beggar. There was something about the fabric, something in the way it was cut, that suggested he had once worn finer things. But she did not ask. It was not her place to press a stranger for answers he had not offered, and besides, there would be time enough for questions once he had regained his strength. An hour passed, and Ren stirred again, his eyes opening slowly, taking in the small room around him with an expression of quiet confusion, as though he had expected to wake somewhere entirely different. "You are safe," Clara said softly. "You are in my home. You collapsed near the crossroads, and I brought you here." He studied her again with that same careful, searching look. "You did not know me," he said. "You did not know if I was dangerous. Yet you brought me into your home." Clara considered this for a moment before answering. "A man who can barely stand is not dangerous," she said. "He is simply a man in need. And besides, I have lived in this village my whole life. I know how to judge people, and something told me you were not someone to fear. And if you had been wrong," she shrugged, a small, tired smile touching her lips, "then I suppose I would have learned a difficult lesson, but I was not wrong, was I?" Ren did not answer, but something shifted in his expression, something that looked almost like admiration, though it was tempered by a weariness that ran far deeper than mere physical exhaustion. Clara rose to check on the water warming near the fire, testing it with her fingers before deciding it was ready. "Here," she said, pouring a small amount into a wooden cup and adding a pinch of dried herbs from one of her jars. "This will help settle your stomach and ease the ache in your body. My mother taught me this remedy many years ago. It has never failed me." Ren accepted the cup with both hands, his fingers trembling slightly as he brought it to his lips. He drank slowly, his eyes never leaving her face, and when he finished, he set the cup down on the small table beside him with a quiet, grateful nod. "Thank you," he said. "I do not know how to repay this kindness." "You do not need to repay it," Clara replied. "Kindness is not a debt to be settled. It is simply something one person offers another, without expectation of return." The fire crackled between them, filling the silence that followed her words, and outside, the wind continued to howl across the frozen fields, indifferent to the small warmth that had been created within the walls of Clara's modest home. She glanced toward the window, watching the darkness deepen, and felt a strange sense of certainty settle over her, a feeling that this evening, this stranger, this moment, was somehow more significant than it appeared on the surface. She could not have known, of course, just how right that feeling would prove to be, or how much her simple act of kindness that evening would come to reshape the course of her entire life. All she knew, in that quiet moment beside the fire, was that a man had needed help, and she had given it, because that was who she was, and that was who she had always been, long before any of this had begun. Ren watched her in silence, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight, and somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the dust and the disguise he wore so carefully, something in him began, for the first time in a very long while, to hope. Morning came slowly over Millbrook, the frost on the windows melting into small rivers of water as the sun climbed higher above the hills. Clara woke to the sound of birds calling outside her cottage, and the faint crackle of the fire she had kept alive through the night. She sat up on the narrow bed she had given up for her guest, having spent the night curled beneath a spare blanket near the hearth, and looked across the room to where Ren still slept in the chair, his breathing steady and deep. She rose quietly, careful not to disturb him, and moved to the small window to check the sky. It promised to be a cold but clear day, the kind of day when work needed to be done despite the chill, for winter was approaching, and there was still wood to gather, animals to tend, and the last of the root vegetables to pull from the frozen garden, before the ground became too hard to dig. As she moved about the cottage preparing for the day, she heard Ren stir behind her. She turned to see him sitting upright, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand, looking far more alert than he had the night before, though still pale and thin in a way that concerned her. "Good morning," she said, offering him a small smile. "How do you feel?" "Better," he admitted, though his voice still carried a rasp of exhaustion. "Much better, thanks to you. I do not think I would have survived the night without your help." Clara waved off the comment with a small shake of her head, though a warmth rose in her chest at his gratitude. "You would have found your way," she said, "but I am glad I was there regardless." She moved to the small pantry shelf where she kept what little food remained from the harvest, calculating silently in her mind. There was a loaf of bread, half a wheel of cheese, and a small pot of vegetable broth she had prepared 2 days earlier, meant to last her through the next 2 days, until she could trade some of her preserved goods at the village market for more supplies. It was not much, but it was what she had, and dividing it meant she would go hungry sooner than planned. She did not hesitate. She had never been the sort of person who could eat comfortably while someone beside her suffered, and though her own stomach ached faintly with the early signs of hunger, she began preparing a plate for Ren without a second thought. "You do not need to do that," Ren said quietly, watching her movements from across the room. "I can see this is more than a simple offering. This is your food, and I have no right to take it from you." "Nonsense," Clara replied firmly, cutting the bread into even portions and ladling broth into 2 wooden bowls. "You need strength to continue on your journey, wherever it may take you, and food is the surest way to build it. I will not have you leaving my home hungry after everything you have already suffered." She set one of the bowls before him along with a portion of bread and cheese, then took her own seat across the small table with an identical portion, though smaller than what she might have prepared if she were not sharing. Ren stared at the food for a long moment before lifting his eyes to meet hers. "This is likely all you have for the next several days," he said, his voice quiet but firm, as though testing whether she understood the weight of what she was doing. "If you give half of it to me, you will go without." "Then I will go without for a short while," Clara said simply, picking up her spoon. "Hunger passes. It is uncomfortable, but it passes. Watching another person starve while I have food to share is something I could not live with. Please, eat. You need it more than I do right now." Ren's expression shifted, something complicated moving behind his gray eyes, a mixture of disbelief and something deeper, something that looked almost like sorrow, though Clara could not understand why such generosity would bring sorrow rather than relief. He picked up the bread slowly, breaking off a small piece, and began to eat with the careful, deliberate movements of someone whose body was still recovering from severe deprivation. They ate in comfortable silence for several minutes. The only sounds in the cottage, the crackle of the fire, and the soft clink of spoons against wooden bowls. Finally, Ren spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "Tell me about yourself, Clara Whitfield," he said. "How does a woman come to live alone in a cottage at the edge of a village, tending land by herself through the harsh winters?" Clara considered the question for a moment, unsure how much of her history to share with a stranger, yet something about his quiet attentiveness made her feel comfortable opening up in a way she rarely did with anyone in the village. "My parents passed some years ago," she said. "My mother to illness, my father in an accident on the northern road not long after. I was left this cottage and this small piece of land, and I have managed it alone since then. It is not an easy life, but it is mine, and I have made peace with its difficulties." "Do you have no family remaining? No one to help you carry this burden?" "None nearby," Clara admitted. "There are neighbors, of course, and some of them are kind, but most keep to themselves, and I have learned not to expect help from anyone but myself. It has made me resourceful, if nothing else." Ren nodded slowly, absorbing her words with a seriousness that seemed disproportionate to the simple conversation they were having. "And yet," he said, "despite carrying this burden alone, despite having so little for yourself, you gave half of your food to a stranger you found collapsed on the road. Does that not strike you as unusual?" Clara laughed softly, shaking her head. "I do not think kindness should be unusual," she said. "I think it should be common. Perhaps the world has simply forgotten that." Something in her answer seemed to strike Ren deeply, and for a long moment he said nothing, only watched her with an expression she could not quite read, somewhere between wonder and quiet determination, as though he were memorizing every word she spoke, every gesture she made, filing them away for some purpose she could not begin to imagine. "You mentioned neighbors," he said eventually, steering the conversation in a different direction. "Are there people in the village who might wonder about a stranger appearing in your home?" "There will be talk," Clara admitted with a small, resigned smile. "There always is, in a village this small. But I have never much cared for gossip, and I do not intend to start caring now. You needed help. I gave it. If others wish to make something more of it, that is their concern, not mine." Ren studied her for a long moment, and Clara noticed, not for the first time, the strange intensity with which he observed her, as though every word she spoke carried a weight far beyond its simple meaning. She wondered, briefly, what kind of life he had lived before finding himself collapsed on a frozen road at the edge of her village, but she did not ask directly, sensing that he was not yet ready to share that part of himself. "I should not stay much longer," Ren said finally, glancing toward the window where the morning light had grown stronger. "I have already taken more from you than I should have, but I confess, I do not feel strong enough yet to continue traveling." "Then you will stay until you are strong enough," Clara said firmly, leaving no room for argument. "I will not send you back out into the cold before you have properly recovered. That would undo everything I did last night to save you." Ren opened his mouth as though to protest, then closed it again, seeming to recognize the futility of arguing with her resolve. Instead, he offered a small, grateful nod. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I do not know how I will ever repay this." "You already told me you do not need to repay it," Clara reminded him with a small smile. "Kindness is not a transaction, Ren. It is simply what one does for another person in need." As the day progressed, Clara returned to her chores, gathering the last of the firewood she had abandoned the previous evening, checking on her small flock of chickens, and tending to the few vegetables still clinging to life in her frozen garden. Ren, despite his weakened state, insisted on helping where he could, carrying smaller loads of wood and watching her work with quiet attentiveness, occasionally offering a hand when his strength allowed. By midday, word had begun to spread through the village, as Clara had known it would. She noticed the curious glances from neighbors as she walked to the well for water, the whispered conversations that fell silent as she passed, and she felt a small knot of unease form in her stomach, though she refused to let it show on her face. She had made her choice the previous evening, kneeling beside a stranger in the frozen field, and she did not intend to let the judgment of others make her regret an act she believed, in her heart, was simply right. Whatever consequences might follow from sheltering an unknown traveler in her home, she would face them with the same quiet resolve that had carried her through every other hardship in her life. What she could not have known, as she walked back toward her cottage with a full bucket of water and the weight of village gossip pressing against her shoulders, was that the stranger, recovering by her fire, was far more than he appeared, and that the choice she had made in a moment of simple compassion was about to set in motion events that would change not only her own life, but the future of the entire dukedom that lay beyond the hills surrounding her quiet, humble village. 3 days passed before Ren felt strong enough to walk without leaning heavily on furniture or walls, and in that time, something unexpected began to grow between him and Clara. A quiet companionship built on shared meals, shared labor, and long conversations that stretched late into the evening as the fire burned low. Clara found herself looking forward to these conversations more than she wanted to admit. There was something about the way Ren listened, truly listened, to everything she said, weighing her words with a seriousness that few people in her life had ever shown her. He asked about her days on the farm, her memories of her parents, the small joys she found in tending her garden and watching the seasons change across the valley. And in turn, though he remained guarded about his own past, he offered fragments of himself, enough to paint the picture of a man who had once lived a very different life, though he never explained exactly what that life had been. On the fourth morning, as Clara prepared a simple breakfast of oats and dried fruit, Ren watched her from his seat by the fire with an expression of quiet curiosity. "May I ask you something, Clara?" he said. "Of course," she replied, stirring the pot over the flames. "You mentioned once that you had rejected a suitor, a man from the village who wished to marry you. Why did you refuse him, if I may ask? Was he unkind to you?" Clara paused in her stirring, considering the question carefully before answering. "Edgar Colton is a wealthy man," she said. "His family owns the largest mill in the region, and he has never known a day of hunger in his life. He proposed to me last spring, believing that marriage to him would solve all my troubles, that I should be grateful for the opportunity to escape this small cottage and this difficult life." "And you refused him because of his wealth?" "I refused him," Clara said, "because he asked for my hand the way a man might purchase a piece of land, expecting gratitude in exchange for comfort, rather than offering genuine affection. He spoke of what he could give me, never of what he felt for me. I could not marry a man who saw me as a burden to be lifted, rather than a person to be loved." Ren was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes fixed on the fire, something thoughtful passing behind them. "That took courage," he said finally. "Many in your position would have accepted such an offer without question, simply for the security it provided. Perhaps," Clara admitted, "but I would rather struggle honestly than live comfortably in a marriage built on convenience rather than genuine care. My parents loved each other deeply, despite having very little. I saw, growing up, what it meant to be truly cherished by another person, and I could not settle for anything less, even if it meant continuing to struggle alone." "And has Edgar accepted your refusal?" Ren asked, something careful entering his tone. Clara's expression darkened slightly. "Not entirely," she admitted. "He has continued to speak of me around the village, sometimes unkindly, suggesting that my refusal was foolish, that I will regret my pride when winter grows harsh and my resources run thin. He is not a cruel man, exactly, but he does not take rejection gracefully." Ren's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, though Clara noticed the small shift in his expression. "I am sorry you have had to endure that," he said quietly. "No one should be made to feel foolish for choosing honesty over convenience." Clara offered him a small, grateful smile, touched by the sincerity in his words. "Thank you, Ren," she said. "It means more than you know, to hear that from someone else." They finished their breakfast in comfortable silence, and afterward, Ren insisted on helping with the morning chores, despite Clara's protests that he should continue resting. He carried water from the well, his steps steadier than they had been the day before, and helped repair a section of fence that had weakened during the recent frost, working with a competence that surprised Clara, given how she had first found him collapsed and helpless on the frozen road. "You handle tools well for a man who claims to have no trade," she observed, as they worked together, securing a wooden post into the frozen ground. Ren paused, his hand still on the post, and for a brief moment, something flickered across his face, a hesitation, a calculation, as though he were deciding how much truth to reveal. "I have had some experience with manual labor," he said carefully, "though perhaps not as much as the calluses on your hands suggest you have endured." Clara laughed softly, holding up her palms, rough and marked from years of farm work. "These hands have seen every season this land has to offer," she said. "I suppose they tell my story better than words ever could." As the days continued, Ren grew stronger, and with his returning strength came a quiet determination to earn his keep, rather than simply accept Clara's charity. He proposed, on the fifth evening, that he stay on as a hired hand, offering to help with the remaining harvest work and the preparations needed before winter fully settled over the valley, in exchange for shelter and meals, until he felt ready to continue his journey. wherever that journey might ultimately lead him. Clara hesitated at first, uncertain whether it was wise to extend such an arrangement with a man whose full history remained a mystery to her. But something in his manner, the steady honesty in his eyes, the genuine effort he had shown in helping around the farm, convinced her that the arrangement was sound. "I cannot pay you much," she warned him. "What little coin I have is meant for supplies before winter fully arrives." "I do not need much," Ren replied. "Shelter and food are more than enough. I only wish to be useful, to repay in some small way the kindness you have shown me." And so the arrangement was settled, and Ren moved his few belongings into the small barn attached to Clara's cottage, where he slept on a bed of clean straw, covered with a spare blanket Clara provided. Each morning he rose early to help with the animals and the remaining harvest work, and each evening he joined Clara for supper, their conversations growing longer and more comfortable with each passing day. Clara found herself, almost without realizing it, beginning to care for this quiet, mysterious stranger in a way that went beyond simple compassion. There was something steady about him, something trustworthy in the careful way he treated her, always respectful, always attentive, never presuming more familiarity than she offered. And in turn, she noticed the way his eyes softened whenever she spoke, the way he seemed to genuinely delight in her small observations about the world around them, the shifting colors of the autumn leaves, the particular call of a bird she had heard since childhood, the quiet satisfaction of a well-tended garden, even in the difficult months of late harvest. Neither of them spoke openly of the growing warmth between them, but it was there, undeniable, woven into every shared meal and every quiet evening beside the fire. Clara told herself, in the private moments when she allowed herself to consider such things, that she was simply grateful for the companionship, for the help around the farm, for the conversations that filled the long, lonely evenings that had once stretched empty and silent before Ren's arrival. But some nights, lying awake on her narrow bed, listening to the wind outside her window, she wondered about the life Ren had left behind, the reasons for his journey, the true nature of the man who had collapsed so unexpectedly at her crossroads, and changed, in ways she was only beginning to understand, the quiet rhythm of her solitary existence. What she could not have known, as autumn deepened into the first true chill of winter, was that Ren carried within him a secret far greater than any she could have imagined, a secret that, when finally revealed, would test everything she believed about honesty, about trust, and about the fragile, precious thing that had begun to grow between them, beside the warmth of her humble hearth. Winter arrived in earnest during the second week of Ren's stay, blanketing Millbrook in a thick layer of snow that transformed the familiar landscape into something quiet and unfamiliar. Clara had expected the isolation of the season to weigh heavily on her, as it always had in previous years. But with Ren's steady presence beside her, the long, cold days felt different this year, fuller somehow, less burdened by loneliness. Yet the peace they had built together was not destined to remain undisturbed. On a particularly bitter morning, as Clara made her way to the village well for water, she noticed a group of women gathered near the market stalls, their heads bent together in conversation, that stopped abruptly the moment they noticed her approach. She recognized the pointed silence immediately, the particular quality of gossip interrupted, and felt her stomach tighten with unease. "Good morning," she said politely, nodding to the women as she passed, refusing to let her discomfort show on her face. "Good morning, Clara," replied Mira Holt, an older woman who had known Clara's mother years before and had always shown her a measure of kindness. But even Mira's greeting carried a strange hesitation, a note of concern beneath the polite words. Clara continued to the well, filled her bucket, and was preparing to leave when Mira approached her privately, glancing around to ensure the other women were out of earshot. "Clara, dear," Mira said quietly, "I do not mean to pry into your affairs, but there is talk in the village about the man staying at your farm. Some say you have taken in a vagrant, a man with no family, no trade, no proper history to speak of. Edgar Colton has been telling anyone who will listen that you have lost your senses, that you are inviting danger into your home." Clara felt a flash of anger rise in her chest, though she kept her voice steady. "Edgar Colton has no right to speak of my choices," she said. "I found a man collapsed and dying on the road, and I helped him. That is all there is to the matter." "I believe you, dear," Mira said gently. "I have never known you to make foolish decisions. But you must understand, gossip spreads quickly in a place this small, and Edgar is bitter over your refusal of his proposal. He seems determined to paint your kindness as recklessness, perhaps hoping to prove that you need a husband's guidance after all." Clara's jaw tightened at the implication, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Let him speak," she said. "I know the truth of my own actions, and that is enough for me." Mira reached out and squeezed Clara's hand with genuine warmth. "I only wanted you to be prepared, dear, in case the talk grows louder. Some in the village are inclined to believe the worst, especially where a woman living alone is concerned." Clara thanked Mira for her concern and made her way back to the cottage, her mind troubled despite her outward composure. She found Wren in the barn, mending a section of fence that had been damaged by the recent snowfall, and though she had not intended to mention the conversation with Mira, something in her expression must have betrayed her unease, for Wren set down his tools immediately and approached her with concern. "What has happened?" he asked. "You seem troubled." Clara hesitated, then decided honesty was the better course. "There is talk in the village," she admitted, "about you staying here. Edgar Colton has been spreading unkind words, suggesting that I have acted foolishly by sheltering a stranger." Something flickered across Wren's face, a complicated mixture of guilt and frustration that Clara could not fully interpret. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I did not intend to bring trouble upon your good name." "You have brought no trouble," Clara said firmly, surprising herself with the conviction in her own voice. "Edgar's bitterness is his own burden to carry, not mine, and certainly not yours. I will not let idle gossip dictate how I choose to live my life." "Even so," Wren said, his voice carrying a weight that seemed disproportionate to the simple village gossip Clara had described. "Perhaps it would be wiser for me to continue on my journey sooner rather than later, to spare you further difficulty with your neighbors." "Is that what you wish?" Clara asked, and though she tried to keep her tone neutral, something in her voice betrayed a flicker of vulnerability she had not intended to reveal. Wren studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. "No," he said finally, his voice quiet but certain. "That is not what I wish. But I would not have you suffer for my sake." "Then let me worry about my own reputation," Clara said, some of the tension easing from her shoulders. "I have lived in this village my entire life, and I have weathered gossip before. I am not so fragile that a few unkind words will break me." Wren nodded slowly, though the troubled expression did not entirely leave his face, and Clara wondered, not for the first time, what burdens he carried that made him so quick to blame himself for difficulties that were not truly his fault. That evening, as they sat together beside the fire sharing a simple supper of root vegetables and salted meat, a knock sounded at the cottage door, sharp and unexpected. Clara rose to answer it, and found Edgar Colton standing on her doorstep, his expensive coat dusted with snow, his expression carrying the particular arrogance of a man accustomed to having his opinions heeded. "Clara," he said, his eyes flicking past her to where Wren sat by the fire, his expression darkening further. "I had hoped we might speak privately." "Anything you wish to say to me, Edgar, you may say in front of my guest," Clara replied, her tone cool but polite. Edgar's lips thinned at the pointed correction, but he pressed forward regardless. "I have come because I am concerned for you," he said, though his tone carried little genuine warmth. "The village is talking, Clara. People are questioning your judgment, sheltering an unknown vagrant in your home with no chaperone, no family present to ensure propriety. Surely you understand how this appears." "I understand that a man was dying on the road, and I offered him shelter," Clara replied evenly. "I understand that compassion should never require an explanation, Edgar, regardless of how it appears to those with nothing better to occupy their minds than gossip." "Do not be foolish, Clara," Edgar snapped, his composure slipping slightly. "You have already refused my offer of marriage, choosing instead to struggle alone on this failing farm. Must you now further damage your reputation by inviting scandal into your home as well?" Wren rose from his seat by the fire, his expression calm, but carrying an unmistakable firmness that made Edgar pause. "I believe the lady has made her position clear," Wren said, his voice quiet, but carrying an authority that seemed at odds with his simple appearance. "Perhaps it would be best if you respected her wishes and took your leave." Edgar's eyes narrowed as he studied Wren more carefully, something calculating passing behind his gaze, though he seemed to find nothing in Wren's worn clothing and weathered appearance to justify further concern. "This is not your concern, stranger," he said dismissively. You would do well to remember your place in this household. My place, Ren replied evenly, is beside a friend who has shown me nothing but kindness, and I will not stand silent while she is spoken to with such disrespect in her own home. Something in Ren's tone, some quality of quiet command that Clara had not heard from him before, seemed to unsettle Edgar, despite his outward bravado. He glanced between the two of them for a long moment, his expression twisting with frustration, and something that might have been jealousy, before finally turning back toward the door. You will regret this choice, Clara, he said coldly. When this stranger has taken what he wants from your home and moved on to wherever vagrants disappear to, you will remember this conversation, and you will wish you had listened to reason. He left without another word, slamming the door behind him hard enough to rattle the small window beside it. Clara stood in silence for a long moment, her heart still pounding from the confrontation, before turning to look at Ren, who remained standing near the fire, his expression troubled. I am sorry, he said quietly. I should not have spoken so forcefully. It is not my place. You defended me, Clara said softly, some of the tension leaving her shoulders as she looked at him. There is nothing to apologize for. Thank you, Ren. He held her gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them, before finally nodding and returning to his seat by the fire. Clara joined him, and though neither of them spoke further of Edgar's visit, the quiet warmth between them felt, in that moment, more steady and certain than it had ever felt before, strengthened rather than weakened by the unwelcome intrusion of the outside world. Yet as Clara settled beside the fire that evening, she could not shake the strange authority she had heard in Ren's voice when he confronted Edgar, a quality of command that seemed entirely unsuited to a man who claimed to have no trade, no family, no history, beyond the vague fragments he had shared with her. And though she pushed the thought aside, telling herself it was simply her imagination, a small seed of curiosity had been planted, one that would continue to grow in the days ahead, until the truth Ren carried could no longer remain hidden. The days following Edgar's unwelcome visit passed in a strange, watchful quiet. Clara noticed the villagers' eyes lingering on her a moment too long whenever she visited the market, noticed the whispered conversations that fell silent in her presence. But she refused to let the scrutiny alter her daily routine. She continued to share her home and her modest resources with Ren, continued to work beside him through the frozen mornings and long evenings. And slowly, the initial sharpness of the village gossip began to soften into background noise, though it never fully disappeared. It was on a particularly clear evening, nearly 3 weeks after Ren's arrival, that Clara noticed something that troubled her more deeply than any village gossip could. She had gone to fetch fresh water from the well after dark, later than usual, and as she returned along the narrow path toward her cottage, she saw a figure moving near the edge of her property. A man dressed in the fine, structured coat of a royal guard, his posture rigid with purpose as he studied the surrounding landscape. Clara paused in the shadow of a nearby tree, watching the stranger with growing unease. He carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, and though he made no move toward her cottage directly, his presence in such a remote corner of the village struck her as deeply unusual. After several long moments, he turned and walked briskly back toward the main road, disappearing into the darkness beyond the tree line. Clara hurried the rest of the way home, her mind racing with questions she could not answer. She found Ren inside, tending the fire, and though she considered mentioning what she had seen, something made her hesitate, an instinct she could not fully explain, warning her to observe a little longer before raising the alarm. Over supper that evening, she watched Ren more closely than she had before, noticing small details she had previously overlooked in the comfortable familiarity of their shared routine. The way he sat with perfect, unconscious posture, even after weeks of physical labor that should have worn such formality away. The precise, careful manner in which he spoke, even in casual conversation, as though every word had been chosen with deliberate intention. The faint calluses on his hands, that did not quite match the pattern of a man accustomed only to farm labor, but suggested instead the grip of a sword or the reins of a finely bred horse. You seem thoughtful tonight, Ren observed, noticing her quiet scrutiny. Clara hesitated, then decided to voice at least part of her growing unease. I saw a man near the property tonight, she said carefully, watching his reaction. Dressed as a royal guard, he seemed to be searching for something, or someone. Something shifted in Ren's expression immediately. a flicker of alarm quickly suppressed beneath a carefully composed calm. "A royal guard," he repeated slowly. "Did he approach the cottage?" "No," Clara said. "He simply observed the area for a time before leaving. But it struck me as strange, Wren. Why would a royal guard have any business in such a remote corner of Millbrook?" Wren was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the fire, and Clara noticed the tension building in his shoulders, the careful stillness of a man calculating how much longer he could avoid a difficult truth. "I do not know," he said finally, though something in his tone suggested otherwise. Clara studied him carefully, her earlier suspicions solidifying into something firmer. "Wren," she said quietly, "is there something you have not told me? Something about who you are, or why you were traveling alone and in such poor condition when I found you?" "Clara," he began, then stopped, seeming to search for words that would not come easily. "There are things about my past that I have not shared, it is true. But I promise you, none of it was meant to bring you harm." "That is not quite an answer," Clara said, her voice steady, despite the growing unease in her chest. Wren rose from his seat and moved toward the window, staring out into the darkness beyond, his back to her, his shoulders carrying a weight that seemed far heavier than she had realized. "I need more time, Clara," he said quietly. "Please, I promise you will have the full truth, but not tonight, not yet." Clara studied his tense posture, the careful way he avoided her gaze, and felt a familiar ache of disappointment rise within her, though she tried to push it aside. She had trusted him, had opened her home and her heart to a stranger, based on nothing more than instinct and compassion, and now, for the first time since she had found him collapsed on the frozen road, she felt the sharp edge of doubt creeping into that trust. "I have given you shelter, food, and honesty since the moment I found you," she said quietly. "I have asked for nothing in return, only trusted that you would be honest with me in whatever way you could manage. If there is danger following you, Wren, danger that might threaten this household, I deserve to know." Wren turned back to face her, his expression pained in a way that struck Clara as genuine, whatever secrets he continued to withhold. "There is no danger to you, Clara," he said firmly. "I would never allow harm to come to you because of choices I have made. But the truth of my situation is complicated, and revealing it too soon could create difficulties I am not yet prepared to navigate. I ask only for a little more patience, and I promise, when the time comes, you will understand everything." Clara studied him for a long moment, weighing his words against the growing unease in her chest. There was sincerity in his voice, in the steady way he met her gaze despite his obvious discomfort, and though her instincts warned her that something significant remained hidden, she found herself unable to fully distrust the man who had shared so many quiet evenings beside her fire, who had defended her honor against Edgar's unkind words, who had worked tirelessly beside her through weeks of difficult winter labor. "Very well," she said finally, though the words carried a weight of reluctant compromise rather than full acceptance. "I will trust you a little longer, Wren. But understand, my patience is not without limits. If this secret you carry brings danger to my home, I will need answers, whether you are prepared to give them or not." Wren nodded slowly, gratitude and something like sorrow mingling in his expression. "Thank you, Clara," he said quietly. "I promise, the truth is coming, sooner than either of us might expect." That night, Clara lay awake long after the fire had burned low, staring at the ceiling of her small cottage, her mind turning over every strange detail she had noticed about the mysterious man now sleeping in her barn. The royal guard near her property, Wren's obvious alarm at the mention of it, the careful, aristocratic bearing beneath his worn clothing, the calluses that suggested a sword rather than a plow. Piece by piece, a suspicion began to form in her mind, one so improbable that she almost dismissed it entirely. But the more she considered the details, the more the pieces seemed to align into a picture she could scarcely believe. A picture that, if true, would explain not only Wren's guarded behavior, but also the presence of royal guards searching the remote corners of her humble village. She did not yet have proof, only instinct and observation. But as sleep finally claimed her that night, Clara could not shake the growing certainty that the man she had rescued from the frozen road was not simply a wandering traveler with no family, no trade, and no history, but something far more significant, something that would soon reshape not only her understanding of him, but perhaps her entire future as well. The following days carried a quiet tension between Clara and Ren, an unspoken awareness that something significant remained unresolved, hovering just beneath the surface of their daily routines. Clara continued her chores, tended her animals, and shared meals with Ren as she had before, but the easy comfort that had grown between them over the previous weeks now carried a careful, watchful edge, as though both of them were waiting for something inevitable to arrive. It was on a cold morning, nearly a week after Clara had spotted the royal guard near her property, that the waiting finally ended. Clara had gone to the village to trade a portion of her preserved vegetables for salt and other winter supplies, and as she made her way through the market square, she noticed an unusual gathering near the village center, a cluster of villagers speaking in hushed, excited tones around a group of mounted men dressed in formal royal colors. Curiosity pulled her closer, and she caught fragments of the conversation as she approached. The men, it seemed, were searching the countryside for the missing heir to the dukedom, a young man who had disappeared from the capital several weeks earlier, under circumstances that remained unclear to the villagers gathered around. Rumors swirled that the old Duke, Corwin Ashford, had fallen gravely ill and was desperate to locate his son before it became too late, that search parties had been dispatched across the entire region, questioning travelers and searching remote villages for any sign of the missing heir. Clara felt a cold chill move through her body that had nothing to do with the winter air, her mind racing back to every strange detail she had noticed about Ren, every careful hesitation, every flash of aristocratic bearing beneath his worn disguise. She pushed through the small crowd, her heart pounding, desperate suddenly to return home and confront the truth she had begun to suspect but had not yet allowed herself to fully believe. She hurried back to her cottage as quickly as her legs would carry her, the basket of trading supplies forgotten and abandoned partway through her transaction, and burst through her front door to find Ren standing near the fireplace, his expression immediately alert at her evident distress. "Clara, what has happened?" he asked, moving toward her. "The missing heir," Clara said breathlessly, her eyes fixed on his face, searching for confirmation of the suspicion that had taken root so firmly in her mind. "The village is full of talk about search parties looking for the Duke's missing son. Ren, is that who you are? Are you the missing heir to the dukedom?" For a long, suspended moment, Ren said nothing, his expression frozen in an unreadable mixture of resignation and something that might have been relief that the truth had finally, inevitably, surfaced. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Yes," he said quietly. "My name is not Ren. I am Alden Ashford, heir to the duchy, and son of Duke Corwin Ashford." Clara felt the ground shift beneath her, though she remained standing perfectly still, her mind struggling to reconcile the quiet, humble man who had shared her home for weeks with the powerful title he now claimed. "Why?" she managed finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you deceive me this way? Why would you hide such a thing from someone who took you into her home, who shared what little she had without question?" "Clara, please, let me explain," Alden said, moving closer, though he stopped when he saw her step back, her expression hardening with hurt and betrayal. "Explain," she said, her voice sharper now, edged with anger she had not expected to feel so intensely. "Explain how you allowed me to believe you were simply a poor traveler, how you allowed me to share my food, my home, my trust, while concealing something so significant. Was this some kind of test, Alden? Some game you played to amuse yourself while your father searched desperately for your return?" "It was never a game," Alden said firmly, though his voice carried genuine pain at her accusation. "My father, fearing for the future of the dukedom, feared that I would marry someone who valued only my title and my wealth, someone incapable of genuine love or loyalty. He asked me to travel in disguise, to find a woman whose character could be trusted, whose kindness was genuine rather than calculated for personal gain." Clara's eyes widened with growing horror as the full weight of his words settled over her. "Then this was exactly a test," she said, her voice trembling now with a mixture of anger and humiliation. "Every kindness I offered, every meal I shared, every moment of trust I extended to you, was simply part of some arrangement, some evaluation, conducted for your father's approval. I was never truly seen as a person to you, Alden. I was an experiment, a candidate to be assessed and judged." "That is not true," Alden said urgently, closing the distance between them despite her evident distress. "Clara, whatever began as my father's design, Everything that grew between us since that first night was genuine. I did not plan to feel what I have come to feel for you. I did not expect to find, in a small cottage at the edge of a humble village, the kind of honest, generous heart I had begun to believe did not exist within the reach of my position. And how am I meant to believe that? Clara said, tears now threatening at the edges of her eyes, though she fought to keep her voice steady, when every word between us has been built upon a foundation of deception. You allowed me to believe in a false name, a false history, a false identity, for weeks, Alden. How can I trust anything you have told me, knowing how easily you concealed such a significant truth? Alden was silent for a long moment, seeming to recognize the depth of the wound his deception had caused, however well-intentioned his original purpose might have been. I understand your anger, he said quietly. I understand that trust, once broken, cannot simply be restored through explanation alone. But Clara, please believe me when I say that everything I have come to feel for you these past weeks has been entirely real, entirely my own, separate from any test my father devised. Clara turned away from him, moving toward the small window of her cottage, staring out at the frozen landscape beyond, her mind a chaotic swirl of emotions she could not fully untangle. Part of her wanted desperately to believe him, to trust in the genuine warmth she had felt growing between them over the past weeks. But another part of her, the part shaped by years of guarding her own vulnerability, of protecting herself from the judgment and manipulation of others, could not so easily forgive the depth of the deception she had just discovered. I need time, she said finally, her voice quiet but firm, not turning to face him. I need time to understand what has happened, to decide what, if anything, I can trust in everything that has passed between us these past weeks. Alden nodded slowly, though Clara could not see the gesture with her back turned. I will give you whatever time you need, he said softly. But please know, Clara, whatever you decide, I do not regret finding you. I do not regret the weeks we have shared, however complicated their beginning may have been. You have shown me more genuine kindness than I have known in my entire life at court, and that truth remains, regardless of anything else. He left the cottage quietly, granting her the solitude she had requested, and Clara remained standing at the window for a long time after his departure, watching the frozen landscape stretch out before her, feeling the full weight of everything she had just learned settle heavily upon her shoulders. The man she had come to care for, the quiet traveler who had shared her fire and her food and her trust, was not simply Wren the wandering laborer, but Alden Ashford, heir to a dukedom, a man whose entire arrival in her life had been orchestrated as part of a search for a suitable bride. She did not know, in that moment, whether the growing affection she had felt for him could survive such a profound revelation, whether the trust that had been so carefully built over weeks of shared labor and quiet conversation could withstand the discovery that its very foundation had been built upon a hidden truth. All she knew, as the winter afternoon light faded slowly into evening shadow, was that nothing between them could ever return to the simple, uncomplicated warmth it had carried before, and that whatever came next would require a courage and clarity of heart that she was not yet certain she possessed. Alden did not return to the barn that night, choosing instead to take a room at the small village inn, giving Clara the space she had requested to process the enormous revelation that had upended everything she believed about the past weeks of her life. Clara spent the evening alone in her cottage, the silence pressing heavily against her, so different from the comfortable quiet she had grown accustomed to sharing with him. She tried to distract herself with her usual chores, mending a torn blanket, sorting through her remaining stores of preserved vegetables, but her hands moved without purpose, her mind circling endlessly back to the conversation that had shattered the fragile world she had built around her growing feelings for the man she had known as Wren. By morning, word of the discovery had somehow already begun to spread through the village, as such news inevitably did, in a place as small and interconnected as Millbrook. Clara suspected one of the royal guards, perhaps recognizing Alden, despite his continued efforts at discretion, had let slip some fragment of the truth to a villager, who had then carried the news like wildfire from house to house. When Clara ventured into the village that morning for supplies, she found herself the object of intense curiosity, villagers watching her with wide eyes and whispered speculation, no longer simply gossiping about a mysterious stranger sheltering in her home, but now discussing the astonishing possibility that Clara Whitfield, humble farm girl, had unknowingly hosted the heir to the entire dukedom within her modest cottage. She had barely made it past the first row of market stalls when Edgar Colton appeared before her, his expression carrying a triumphant, cruel satisfaction that made Clara's stomach turn with dread. "So," Edgar said, his voice carrying easily across the small square, drawing the attention of nearby villagers. "It seems your vagrant was not quite so humble as you believed, Clara. Tell me, did you know all along that you were entertaining nobility in your home, or were you truly foolish enough to be deceived so completely?" Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, humiliation and anger warring within her chest, as she became acutely aware of the many eyes now watching the exchange. "I did not know," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady, despite the churning emotions inside her. "And I fail to see how my ignorance of his identity changes the kindness I offered a man I believed to be suffering and in need." "Perhaps not," Edgar said, his smile widening unpleasantly, "but it certainly changes how the village will view you now. Some might say you set your sights on nobility from the very beginning, hoping to elevate your fortunes through whatever means necessary. Others might simply pity you, a foolish woman deceived by a clever ruse, made to believe she had found genuine affection, when in truth she was merely being tested and measured like livestock at market." The cruel accuracy of his words struck Clara harder than she wanted to admit, echoing the very fears that had kept her awake through the long, restless night. She opened her mouth to respond, but found herself momentarily unable to summon the words, her composure threatening to crack beneath the combined weight of public humiliation and private heartbreak. It was at that moment that a familiar voice cut through the tension, firm and unmistakably authoritative. "That is quite enough." Clara turned to see Alden approaching, no longer dressed in the torn, dusty clothing of a wandering traveler, but in simple, well-tailored garments that, while still modest compared to what she imagined true nobility typically wore, carried an unmistakable air of dignity and purpose. His posture, always subtly formal, even in disguise, now seemed entirely natural, unburdened by the need for pretense. Edgar's expression shifted immediately, from cruel satisfaction to nervous uncertainty, as he recognized the true weight of the man now standing before him. "Your Grace," he stammered, offering an awkward, hasty bow. "You will address Clara Whitfield with respect," Alden said, his voice carrying a quiet command that silenced the murmuring crowd around them. She showed kindness to a stranger she believed to be in genuine need, expecting nothing in return, not knowledge of his identity, not favor, not advancement. That she now stands accused of scheming, or foolishness, by those too small of heart to understand genuine compassion, is a reflection of the accuser's character, not hers. Edgar's face reddened with embarrassment, and he stammered an apology before quickly retreating into the crowd, though the damage of his earlier cruelty lingered in the whispered conversations that continued around the market square. Clara stood frozen, uncertain how to respond to Alden's unexpected defense. Her earlier anger toward him tangled uncomfortably with a rush of gratitude for his intervention. "You did not need to do that," she said quietly, once the immediate crowd had begun to disperse, though some curious onlookers still lingered at a respectful distance. "I did," Alden replied firmly. "I have already caused you enough difficulty through my deception. I will not stand silent while you are further humiliated because of choices I made, choices that were never meant to bring you harm." Clara studied him for a long moment, the morning light catching the earnest concern in his gray eyes, and felt some of her earlier anger softening, though the deeper hurt of his deception remained unresolved. "I still do not know what to make of everything that has happened," she admitted quietly. "Trust, once shaken, does not simply repair itself because of a single act of defense in a marketplace." "I understand," Alden said, "and I do not expect it to. I only wished you to know that I will not allow you to bear the burden of my father's design alone, nor will I allow cruel voices to diminish the genuine kindness you showed me, whatever confusion my deception may have caused." They stood together for a moment longer, the winter air cold around them, the weight of unresolved questions hanging heavily between them, before Clara finally excused herself to complete her errands, leaving Alden standing alone in the market square, watching her retreat with an expression of quiet, patient determination that suggested he had no intention of simply walking away from what had grown between them, regardless of how difficult the path ahead might prove to be. That evening, alone once more in her cottage, Clara found herself replaying the events of the day. Edgar's cruel words, the humiliating weight of public scrutiny, and Alden's firm, unwavering defense of her character before the entire gathered crowd. She realized, with some reluctance, that despite everything, despite the sting of his deception, she could not simply dismiss the genuine care he had shown, both during his weeks of disguise and in his willingness to publicly stand beside her, despite the complications his true identity had introduced into her quiet, humble life. Yet questions remained unanswered. Questions about what any future connection between them might mean, about the vast differences in their circumstances, about whether a woman of her humble station could ever truly find a place within the world of dukes and formal court proceedings that Alden's true identity represented. As she settled into her narrow bed that night, staring up at the familiar shadows of her cottage ceiling, Clara understood that the coming days would demand difficult decisions, choices that would shape not only her own future, but potentially the future of the entire dukedom that now, however unexpectedly, seemed entwined with her own quiet, ordinary life. Nearly a week passed following the confrontation in the market square, and though Alden did not return to Clara's cottage during that time, respecting the space she had requested, Clara found herself unable to fully escape thoughts of him, or the complicated tangle of emotions his revelation had stirred within her. The village, too, remained abuzz with speculation, though the tone had shifted somewhat since Alden's public defense of her character, with many villagers now regarding Clara with a curious mixture of newfound respect and quiet envy, imagining the possibilities that might now lie before her. It was on a gray, overcast morning that a messenger arrived at Clara's cottage, a young man dressed in the formal colors of the ducal household, his expression carrying an urgency that immediately set Clara's nerves on edge. "Miss Whitfield," he said, offering a respectful bow, "I have been sent to inform you that Duke Corwin Ashford's health has taken a sudden and serious decline. The physicians fear he may not have much longer. His son, Duke Alden, has asked me to convey his hope that you might consider visiting the ducal estate, though he understands entirely if you choose not to, given the circumstances of your parting." Clara felt a rush of complicated emotions at this unexpected news. Sympathy for a dying man she had never met, concern for Alden facing the loss of his father, and a lingering uncertainty about what her presence at such a moment might mean for her own future. She thought of the weeks she had spent with Wren, before she had known him as Alden, the genuine warmth and companionship that had grown between them despite the deception at its foundation, and found herself, almost against her own inclination toward caution, agreeing to accompany the messenger to the ducal estate. The journey took the better part of the day, carrying her further from Millbrook than she had ever traveled in her life, through winding roads that eventually gave way to the grand approach of the ducal estate, a sprawling stone manor, surrounded by formal gardens, now dusted with the season's first true snowfall. Clara felt increasingly out of place as the carriage carried her closer, acutely aware of her simple, worn traveling clothes amid such grandeur, though she reminded herself firmly that whatever the surroundings, she remained the same woman who had knelt beside a stranger on a frozen road weeks earlier, motivated by nothing more than simple compassion. She was led through the grand entrance of the manor by a formal attendant, past hallways lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors and elegant tapestries depicting scenes of hunts and formal ceremonies, until she was brought to a quiet sitting room where Alden waited, his expression carrying exhaustion and grief that struck Clara immediately, softening whatever remaining reservations she had carried into this unfamiliar place. "Clara," he said, rising immediately as she entered, relief and gratitude evident in his voice. "Thank you for coming. I did not expect you would, given everything that has passed between us, but I am grateful beyond words that you did." "How is your father?" Clara asked gently, setting aside her own complicated feelings in favor of genuine concern for the man before her. "Weakening," Alden admitted, his voice heavy with sorrow. "The physicians believe it will not be much longer now. He has asked to meet you, Clara, before his strength fails entirely. I understand if you would rather not, given the circumstances of how our own connection began, but I could not refuse his request without at least conveying it to you." Clara considered this for a long moment, studying the genuine grief etched into Alden's features, and felt her earlier hesitation soften into something closer to compassion. "I will meet him," she said quietly. "Whatever has passed between us, I would not deny a dying man his final wishes." Alden led her through another series of hallways to a formal bedchamber, where Duke Corwin Ashford lay propped against a mountain of pillows, his face pale and drawn with illness, though his eyes, when they settled on Clara, carried a sharp, assessing intelligence that belied his physical frailty. "So," the old Duke said, his voice weak but carrying an unmistakable warmth, "this is the young woman who shared her last provisions with a stranger on the road, expecting nothing in return." "Your Grace," Clara said, offering a careful, uncertain bow, uncertain of the proper formal etiquette for such an encounter. "No need for such formality with me, child," the Duke said, a faint smile touching his weathered features. "I have heard much about you these past weeks, from the reports my men gathered during my son's journey, and more recently, from my son himself, who speaks of you, with a warmth I have not heard in his voice in a very long time." Clara glanced toward Alden, uncertain how to respond, and saw him watching her with an expression of quiet hope that made her heart ache with the complicated tangle of feelings she still carried toward him. "I sent my son on this journey," the Duke continued, "because I feared for the future of this dukedom, feared that he would be surrounded his entire life by those who valued only his title and the wealth attached to it, never seeing the man beneath the position. I hoped, perhaps foolishly, that somewhere in this kingdom there existed a heart generous enough to offer kindness without calculation, without expectation of reward. I did not know who he was," Clara said quietly. "I offered help because he was suffering, not because I imagined any benefit to myself." "I know," the Duke said, his weak voice carrying surprising conviction. "That is precisely why my son speaks of you as he does, and why I asked to meet you myself before my time grows too short. I understand that his deception has caused you pain, and for that, I offer my sincere apology, for the design was mine as much as his execution. But I hope, in time, you might find it within yourself to see past the manner in which you met, and consider the genuine connection that grew despite it." Clara felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, moved by the old Duke's sincerity, by the weight of his failing health pressing against the urgency of his words. "I do not know what the future holds, Your Grace," she admitted honestly, "but I am grateful to have met you, and I am sorry for your suffering." The Duke reached out a trembling hand, and Clara, without hesitation, moved forward to take it gently in her own. "Whatever you decide, child," he said softly, "know that you have already given an old man a measure of peace, seeing with my own eyes the kind of heart my son has found, even if the path to finding it was imperfect." They remained together for a while longer, the Duke growing increasingly tired as the conversation continued, until finally, Alden gently suggested that his father needed rest, and Clara found herself led back through the quiet hallways of the estate, her mind and heart heavy with the weight of everything she had witnessed and heard. "Thank you for coming," Alden said quietly, as they stood together in the formal entrance hall, the winter light fading outside the tall windows. "I know it could not have been an easy choice." "He is a good man," Clara said softly. "Whatever happened between us, Alden, your father's intentions were rooted in genuine concern for your future, and for the future of those who depend upon your leadership. I cannot fault him for that, even if I still struggle with the manner of its execution." "And what of us?" Alden asked quietly, his voice carrying a vulnerability Clara had not heard from him before, not even during the weeks of his disguise. "Is there any path forward, Clara, or has my deception closed that door entirely?" Clara considered the question carefully, weighing the genuine warmth she still felt toward him, against the lingering hurt of discovering how their connection had truly begun. "I do not know yet," she said honestly. "But I no longer believe the door is entirely closed, Alden. I simply need more time to understand what any future between us might truly mean, for both of us." Alden nodded slowly, accepting her honest uncertainty with a patience that spoke to the depth of his own genuine feeling. As Clara made the long journey back to Millbrook that evening, her mind turned over everything she had witnessed at the ducal estate, the old Duke's genuine warmth despite his failing health, Alden's quiet vulnerability as he asked about their future, and she began to understand, with growing clarity, that whatever fear or hesitation still lingered within her, the connection between them had never truly been about titles or deception, but about two people who had found, in each other, a kind of honesty and understanding that neither had expected to encounter in the ordinary course of their separate lives. 2 weeks passed following Clara's visit to the ducal estate, and during that time, she returned to her quiet routine in Millbrook, tending her animals, managing her small farm, and turning over in her mind, again and again, everything she had witnessed and felt during her brief encounter with the dying Duke and his son. She had expected the passage of time to bring clarity, yet instead, she found her feelings growing more complicated with each passing day, torn between the lingering hurt of Alden's deception and the undeniable warmth she still carried for the man who had shared her fire and her food during those first quiet weeks of his disguise. Word reached the village shortly afterward that Duke Corwin Ashford had passed away peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by his household staff and physicians, having lived just long enough to see his son settled on a path he believed would lead to genuine happiness, rather than the hollow arrangements of calculated nobility. The news brought a somber mood to Millbrook, many villagers expressing genuine sympathy for the young Duke, now bearing the full weight of his title and responsibilities alone. Clara felt the news deeply, remembering the old Duke's weak but earnest voice, his genuine gratitude for her kindness, his sincere hope that she might find a way past the imperfect circumstances of her meeting with his son. She wondered how Alden was managing the grief of losing his father, while simultaneously assuming the full responsibilities of leadership over the entire dukedom, and found herself, despite her earlier hesitation, genuinely concerned for his well-being. It was nearly a month after the Duke's passing that Alden returned to Millbrook himself, not in disguise this time, but in the formal, dignified bearing of his true position, accompanied by a modest retinue of attendants who remained respectfully at a distance as he approached Clara's cottage on foot, much as he had approached that very land months earlier, though under vastly different circumstances. Clara was tending her chickens when she noticed his approach, and she straightened slowly, her heart pounding with a complicated mixture of anticipation and uncertainty as he drew closer. "Alden," she said quietly, setting aside her basket of feed, "I did not expect you." "I know," he said, stopping a respectful distance away, his gray eyes carrying the weight of grief and responsibility that had settled over him in the weeks since his father's passing, though beneath it, Clara could still see the same earnest warmth she had come to know during his disguise. "I have thought of little else these past weeks besides everything that passed between us, and I could not continue governing this dukedom without first knowing whether any path remained open between us." "Your father has passed," Clara said softly. "I am truly sorry, Alden. He was kind to me in the brief time I knew him, and I could see how deeply he cared for your future happiness." "Thank you," Alden said, his voice carrying genuine emotion. "His final days were made easier, I believe, by meeting you, by seeing for himself the character he had hoped I would find. I owe him a debt I can never fully repay, and I intend to honor his memory by governing this dukedom with the same compassion he hoped to instill in me through this entire journey." They stood together in silence for a moment, the winter wind moving gently around them, before Alden continued, his voice growing more earnest. "Clara, I have not come today to press you for an answer you are not ready to give. I understand that trust, once shaken, requires patience to rebuild, and I am prepared to offer whatever time you need. But I could not continue without telling you plainly, one final time, exactly what I feel." Clara remained silent, watching him, her heart pounding as she waited for him to continue. "I did not expect, when my father sent me on this journey, to find anything beyond a suitable candidate to satisfy his concerns about my future marriage," Alden said. "I anticipated meeting someone whose character I could assess and report back, nothing more. What I found instead, in you, was a genuine connection, unlike anything I had known in my entire life at court, surrounded as I have always been by those who valued only my title and my wealth. You shared your last provisions with a stranger you believed had nothing to offer you in return. You defended your own convictions against Edgar Colton's cruel words, and against the judgment of your entire village, without ever wavering from your genuine character. And through it all, you showed me a kind of honest, uncalculated warmth that I had begun to believe did not exist within reach of someone in my position." Tears gathered in Clara's eyes as she listened, the weight of his words settling deeply into her heart, softening the last remaining edges of hurt and hesitation that had lingered since the day she had learned the truth of his identity. "I do not offer you a title, Clara, or a position of power, though those things will inevitably accompany any future we might build together," Alden continued. "I offer you simply myself, the man you knew as Wren, the man who learned from you, more than from any teacher or advisor at court, what genuine kindness and honesty truly mean. Whatever you decide, know that meeting you has changed me permanently, regardless of the path our futures ultimately take. Clara stepped closer to him, her earlier hesitation finally giving way entirely to the genuine warmth she had carried for him since those first quiet evenings beside her humble fire. "I forgave your deception long before today, Alden," she said softly. "What I needed was simply to understand that the connection between us was as real to you as it was to me, that I was not merely a test to be passed, but a person genuinely seen and valued." "You were never merely a test," Alden said firmly, moving closer still. "From the very first evening, when you split your last provisions without hesitation, you became someone I could not stop thinking about, someone whose character I admired more deeply than I had admired anyone in my entire life." Clara felt a genuine smile spread across her face, the first true, unguarded smile she had offered him since learning the truth of his identity. "Then perhaps," she said softly, "there is indeed a path forward between us, Alden Ashford, however unconventional its beginning may have been." Alden's expression lit with genuine joy at her words, and he reached for her hand, holding it gently within his own. "Clara Whitfield," he said, his voice carrying both formal weight and genuine tenderness, "will you consider joining me, not as a duty imposed by my father's design, but as a choice made freely by both our hearts, to build a future together, one grounded in the same honesty and compassion that first brought us together on that frozen road?" Clara looked into his eyes, seeing there the same steady warmth she had first noticed weeks earlier beside her humble hearth, and felt, for the first time since learning the truth of his identity, a complete and genuine certainty settle over her heart. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she glanced past him, toward the modest cottage that had sheltered her entire life, toward the frozen field beyond, where she had once knelt beside a suffering stranger, without a single thought of what it might cost her. Everything that mattered to her, her memories of her parents, her hard-won independence, the quiet rhythm of a life built on honest labor, lived within the boundaries of that small piece of land. Whatever answer she gave now would carry her far beyond it, into a world of formal halls and public duty she had only glimpsed once, briefly, while sitting beside a dying man who had asked nothing of her except honesty. "Before I answer," she said quietly, "I want you to understand something, Alden. I am not the same woman who might have accepted Edgar Colton for the comfort his wealth could offer. If I join you, it will not be for the title, and it will not be because a dukedom needs an heir. It will be because I have chosen you, freely, as the man who once sat by my fire, with nothing to his name that I could see, and treated me, even then, as someone worth truly listening to." "I would want nothing less," Alden said, his voice steady, despite the emotion beneath it. "I have had my fill of arrangements built on convenience. I would rather govern this dukedom beside a woman who chose me for myself than beside one who accepted a crown." Clara nodded slowly, feeling the last of her hesitation settle into quiet resolve. "Then yes," she said, "I will." News of the engagement spread through Millbrook within a single day, carried from house to house far faster than any royal messenger could have managed alone. Clara had braced herself for a fresh wave of gossip, expecting the same mixture of envy and suspicion that had followed Alden's earlier revelation, but what she found instead surprised her. Neighbors who had once whispered behind her back now greeted her warmly in the market square, and even Mira Holt, wiping tears from her eyes, embraced Clara tightly and told her that her late mother would have been proud beyond words. Edgar Colton, notably, did not appear among the well-wishers. Clara heard, some weeks later, that he had left Millbrook entirely to manage his family's mill in a distant town, unwilling to remain in a village where his cruelty toward her had become common knowledge, and where every conversation now seemed to circle back, in one way or another, to the woman he had once dismissed as foolish. Alden insisted that the wedding preparations move at a pace comfortable for Clara, refusing to rush her into the formal customs of court life before she felt ready to navigate them. He arranged for a tutor, a patient older woman named Bettina Marsh, to gently guide Clara through the expectations of her new position, though Alden made clear, again and again, that he had no interest in changing the fundamental character that had drawn him to her in the first place. "I do not want a duchess who has forgotten how to speak plainly with her own people," he told her one evening, as they sat together reviewing a list of formal customs Bettina had prepared. "Learn what you must to navigate the court, Clara, but never lose the woman who knelt in a frozen field for a stranger without a second thought. The wedding itself took place on a warm morning in early summer, in the very village square where Clara had spent her entire life, decorated simply with wildflowers gathered from the surrounding hills, rather than the elaborate arrangements typical of noble ceremonies. Villagers lined the square alongside members of the ducal household, an unusual mixture of humble farmers and formal attendants that reflected, perfectly, the union being celebrated that day. Clara wore a simple dress of pale blue, nothing like the elaborate gowns she imagined true noblewomen typically wore for such occasions, and when Alden saw her approaching, his expression carried such open, unguarded joy that any remaining doubt in Clara's heart dissolved entirely. They exchanged vows written in their own words rather than the formal language of court tradition, promises built on honesty, patience, and the genuine partnership they had discovered together, however unusual its beginning had been. In the years that followed, Duchess Clara Ashford became known throughout the dukedom for a kind of leadership rarely seen among nobility, one grounded in genuine attentiveness to the struggles of ordinary people. She established granaries in every major village to guard against the kind of desperate hunger that had once brought a suffering stranger to her doorstep, ensured that travelers on the region's roads would always find shelter available should misfortune strike them far from home, and worked alongside Alden to reform practices that had long favored wealthy landowners over the small farmers who made up the majority of the dukedom's population. She returned often to Millbrook, maintaining her small cottage as a private retreat where she and Alden could escape the formal demands of court life, tending the same modest garden she had cared for since childhood, though now with the help of hired hands, who could manage the work she no longer had time to do alone. She never forgot the frozen crossroads where she had first knelt beside a collapsed traveler, and in later years, she commissioned a simple stone marker at that exact spot, inscribed with words that captured the entire foundation of everything that had followed. Kindness, offered freely, returns in ways no one can foresee. Alden, for his part, governed the dukedom with a compassion his father had hoped to see, remembering always the lesson Clara had taught him, without ever intending to teach anything at all. That genuine character reveals itself not in grand gestures, performed for an audience, but in small, quiet choices, made when no one is watching, when there is nothing obvious to be gained, and everything, perhaps, to lose. Their children grew up hearing the story of how their parents had met, a hungry traveler and a generous farm girl, neither aware of what the other would come to mean, and the tale became something of a legend throughout the dukedom, told to remind every generation that thrones and titles matter little, beside the simple, enduring truth that a good heart, tested by hardship and proven through honest kindness, is worth more than any crown ever forged. And so it was that Clara Whitfield, once a poor young woman tending a modest farm at the edge of a small village, became not only a duchess, but a symbol throughout the land of what genuine goodness could accomplish, not through ambition or design, but through the simple, unwavering choice to share what little she had with a stranger who needed it more than she did, on a cold winter evening that changed the course of her entire life, and the life of an entire dukedom, forever.